Okay, can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to be talking about a lot of hormones today, hormones and the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is going to be responsible for controlling and coordinating growth, metabolism, temperature regulations, how we respond to stresses, our reproductive system, and a lot of other functions. The hormone or the endocrine system does a lot. Okay.
So now that we're gonna, I have a question related to hormones.
Yes.
Naturally, all hormones are produced in the body, or we have certain hormones that we have to get from certain foods or certain items.
Um, More okay. Let me answer this. So the hormones are being produced in our body.
Uh,
However, we have we have components that we need from other sources of food to be able to produce those hormones. Okay. Now, hormones from foods can also affect our body. Okay. So, like for instance, let me give you an example. So they know that like in the dairy industry, so what they would do, they would actually stimulate cows to produce more milk by giving them more hormones, right? And as a result of that, by them putting so much hormones in the system, those cows produce more milk, but within that milk, it also carried some of those hormones. So then when you drink the milk, then you start producing more milk at a younger age. And so they were finding that young girls are developing a lot faster in terms of their breasts and things like that as a result of hormones that were being given to them via milk, right? By, you drink milk, it makes you stronger. Well, the milk was kind of saturated with various hormones that would cause them to produce more milk, start them to produce milk earlier than what they would normally do it because their body is regulated in a certain way that they wouldn't produce it normally. But now that hormone is being introduced outside, it can affect things as well too. Does that make sense?
mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, because I know some hormones are naturally produced in the body, but I wanted to know if by eating certain foods, certain things are also gonna affect those normal hormones that you have in the body.
Yes. Yes. If you don't get the precursors, then what will happen is that you may not produce that hormone because you don't have the key parts that you need to produce it. So yeah, foods foods impact it greatly. Like for instance, another thing, soy milk. So soy milk basically contains a protein that is a precursor for estrogen. So men who drink high abundance of soy milk could have issues where they start developing breasts, and that's a result of that soy protein, right? Because it has that precursor and it sends that signal that you need to be producing it. So our body, being male, we have that option of making that switch at some point during development. So you do it like early on during development that makes us a man. Where, but what you're doing, you're producing a precursor that suggests that you may not be all man until your body will start developing breast tissue. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So so let's kind of do a quick comparison, right, between the endocrine system and the nervous system. So the way that we signal things in the endocrine system. Let's see. Here's mine. the way that we're going to be signaling things in the endocrine system is going to be the chemicals. So when we think about the nervous system, how do we do the electrical impulse, or that the action potential? How do we send the charge down the axons of the nerve cells?
Would it be the electric signals or the electric impulses?
Okay, so what causes that electrical impulse, that electrical potential? Do you guys remember? You guys remember?
Not really, kind of.
Kind of. You don't remember about those charges? What's causing those charges? Like you're talking about that electrical impulse. What causes that electrical impulse? I can hardly hear you guys. Let's see, something's wrong. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I can't hear you guys. Give me a second. Jesse, can you say something for me?
Yes.
Okay. Good. I got it fixed. Okay, so do you guys remember what causes those electrical impulses? I know it's a rough day. We're getting started back, and we turned up on Mother's Day. You got your mom nice and toasty by getting her that bottle of wine, and you drank it with her and everything. So you were saying, I mean, as a center, you're on that right track. You were talking about the action potential. But what causes that electrical potential? What is causing it actually? Think about what you've learned so far.
There's like a stimulating going on when it comes to those electric impulses.
Well, yeah, so we have a simulation, right? So that simulation does something. What does that simulation do to cause the things to go and change, so you end up with electrical impulses? You guys remember? What flows in and what flows out? What's flowing in and out of the cell? How's that to happen? Calcium, you remember the calcium ion and the sodium ion channels? So basically chemicals, specifically ions, right? So ions are going to be that root. So that's going to be the same thing with the endocrine system. A lot of our signals are going to be chemicals. So we're going to have chemicals that are going to be responsible, in the case of the endocrine system, for signaling. Okay. So what is going to be, in terms of, when we talk about that chemical signaling, the primary things that we're going to have is going to be hormones. And then for neurons, what was it?
The electrical impulse.
What's causing it? So if hormones causes that the outcome, so what would be the equivalent of a hormone in the nervous system? Acetylcholine is an example of it. Boy, we're in trouble, aren't we? Neurotransmitters, you guys remember those?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so in the endocrine system, the distance that these things are traveling, these chemicals are traveling, they can be long or they can be short. So these hormones are traveling in long distances or short distances. Okay, what about in the nervous system? Are the neurotransmitters traveling long distances or short distances, or both?
Both.
Not both. Think about it. Okay, so we have that synapses. So that synapses, what happens at the synapses? Anybody? Letitia, are you there?
Yes,
What happens at the synapses?
the synapses.
Okay, so here's the synapses. We got that nerve on the other side. We're trying to get things to. So what do we do? What happens? How do we send that signal? What do we use to send the signal?
We send signals with the nerves.
Okay, so we have this nerve and it goes down. We've done that electric potential. And then at the synapses, we have these guys meeting. You have the synaptic junction. So how do I send signals to this other nerve? Does it just happen magically? Or is there something that we release and something that is accepted?
We release, I forgot what it was, but we do release the command from, oh my goodness, what was it?
I know I'm catching you guys all off guard today, huh?
Yes.
So you're getting there. You're getting to the point. So what are these guys again? What is neurotransmitters?
They transmit the commands.
How to spell it? They transmit the commands. Okay, so what are they though? Look above it. Often they're chemicals, right? They're chemicals. If we look at them, they're either chemicals or they're going to be peptides, which is also in a way a chemical, right? So the neurotransmitter sends it's released from the neuron, and then it's sending the signal to the other neuron at that junction, right? At that synaptic junction. So it sends that signal, it binds to a receptor, and then it causes the electrical impulse cascade to start happening again down there. So you're sending that signal to say, hey, by the way, you need to open up. We need to move. We need to do something, right? So you're sending that signal via chemical, right? And that has to be done at a short range. Why does that have to be done at a short range? Because if we did it at a long range, what would happen?
They probably would miss and would not transmit the.
Yeah, it would take forever, right? So I'm putting my hand on the stove, right? Sticking my hand on the stove. If I keep my hand on the stove, what's going to happen?
You're gonna burn it.
I'm going to burn up my hand, right? Do I want to do that?
No.
So do I need a fast response or do I need a slow response for these neurotransmitters and things?
You would need a fast response.
I need a fast response, right? Because the nervous system is requiring us to have a fast response. We can't wait for the sit there. We make this one drug and we have to wait 3 hours or 4 hours before we decide to remove our hand. We can't do it that way, can we? We have to respond fast, right? So that is going to be a short, in the terms of the distance that's going to be traveled. These neurotransmitters are only going to travel a short distance. And the reason why they can travel a short distance where the hormones, they can travel a long distance, right? You know, how old do you have to be to start developing, or how old are you when you start developing boobies as a woman? Or you start developing hair going through puberty? How old?
Like 9, 12-ish.
Well, today 9 and 12-ish, but in the old days, it used to be about 12, 13, 14, something around there, right?
Yeah.
So you have time. Well, and so in that case, you have time, right? We have plenty of time to sit there and get those signals through the body because you have 9 to 12 years to sit there and do it, right? It doesn't have to be something done instantaneously, right? Where if we have our hand on the stove, we want to move it pretty fast, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So then our response time to this is going to be, is it going to be fast and slow in terms of the endocrine system?
It would be slow. Well,
Slow.
if we're talking about purity, yeah.
Yeah. Or it could be fast. So it could be both. In this case, we could have both. It could be fast or it could be slow in terms of response. Okay, what about our nervous system? Does it have to be fast or does it need to be slow?
I say that has to be fast.
Right. Always got to be fast, right?
Yeah.
Because if it isn't fast, let's say we talked about flight or flight, right? Let's say we have this lion in the backyard, right? What is going to be our response? Are we going to just sit there? You know, there's a lion in the backyard, you know, and you're outside with it. What are you going to do? You're just going to sit there, maybe water the flowers, and is that going to be your response?
No.
No, I hope not. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any Letitia or Azucena or Jesse, right? We'd be screwed. We'd be lion meat, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So we have to have fast response when it comes to the nervous system, where the endocrine system.
But,
yes. Go ahead.
I this kind of brings on, this is a little off topic, but I've noticed that some people just stay like shocked, like they don't know what to do.
Like a deer in headlights.
Yeah, or like so my son was like 2 years old and he was eating a piece of watermelon and he was sitting right next to my mom. And for some reason, I guess he must have gotten a big piece of watermelon and was choking. I heard him, I was in the kitchen. I heard him kind of gasping for air and my mom was right next to him, but she was just staring at him like if he was going to slowly process that. And I ran real quick and did the Heimlich on him. But yeah. It was just kind of like, you're right there. And you could have just.
Yeah, you could have grabbed him and did.
Yeah.
So, but that
Like,
also kind of says something about age, right? So
yeah.
as we get older, our response times are a lot slower. Our processing times are a lot slower. Oh, what's going on? What are they doing, right? And so that's typically, a lot of times that's due to neurological damage over time, right? So we're not getting that response that we do. And then sometimes it's just that we've become so kind of immune to it. We're like, ah, that happens all the time. You'll be fine, and he'll cough it out, or, so we've gotten, what is the word that I'm looking for? We're so saturated by stimulations that we don't know how to respond to them anymore, you know? And that could be a huge component. Somebody who's dealt with a lot of trauma, a lot of stress throughout the majority of their life, when stress and trauma hits, you become numb to it. You don't know what to do. You're just kind of like, that's a good question. Okay. The environment, the environmental targets, right? So our nervous system, it responded to stimuli that were on the inside and on the outside. So the environment was inside and outside. The endocrine system is going to be internally, right? And so we're going to be primarily responding to internal targets, okay? Where the nervous system has to do both internal and external, okay? Okay. So you guys know what hormones are, right?
Yes.
Hormones are just going to be secreted chemicals, to put it simply, right? So often they're going to be going to the bloodstream. That's going to be their route of transport. And they're going to have targets. They're going to be receptors on cells that they need to bind to for things to happen. And then we have cases where the endocrine system is going to engage the nervous system, right? We did talk about a little bit earlier about the flight or fight response. Now, in the case of your mom, right? She had a delayed response. And so you also have components in the endocrine system that are going in the bloodstream that causes things to go up, like you have stress hormones. They cause things to be stressed. But it takes a little bit longer for those stress hormones to respond compared to your nervous system, which also is responding to that stress. Okay, so if you take a look here, this is just basically, these are the glands and the cells in the body that play a huge role in homeostasis, and then they're responsible for the secretion and the production of the hormones that are going to be being pushed out through the bloodstream, okay? And so we have the pineal gland, clear. We have the thalamus, we have the pituitary gland, right? And so all of those are located in our brain in the cranial component. We have the thyroid, the thymus, we have the adrenal gland, we have the pancreas, we have the uterus, we have the ovarian glands, and we have the testes, okay, or the ovaries. And so these are all components that are going to be responsible for the hormones that are going to be produced in your body. And so you have a good idea that you have these areas where your body's going to be receiving hormones throughout the entire bloodstream. And so they have distances to travel. And so these components have to be stable enough to sit there and make it through the blood system, so they can't be broken down. So their sequence are going to be very important and stuff like that in terms of how they're made, and they need to be stable for that long distance travels. And sometimes they'll be put in vesicles for that travel event. Okay. So, okay. So these are just some examples of different hormones in our body, and so and the structures of these hormones. So we have the amine hormone, which is norepinephrine, and so you see a very simple structure. A little amine group on the end. You have that cyclic, the cyclic carbon or hydrocarbon there with the hydroxyl groups on the ends, right? So this is an example of a peptide hormone. So the difference between a peptide and often we make the difference between a peptide and a protein. Well, a peptide is typically just a shorter sequence of amino acids that are brought together, where a protein is the long chains of amino acids that basically are very organized and oriented. Not that the peptide chains aren't organized, they are organized, but they're typically very short in sequence compared to a protein. So there'll be the distinction there. So we have the oxy to Sidon. So basically, you just see a nice little short chain, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 amino acids. And it also forms this little ring structure, right? Very simple, not too long. And where our growth hormones will sit there and be long chains of amino acids that are, in the case of the growth hormones, there's 2 subunits. The first subunit is shown here in the the purple and green. And then the second subunit is actually shown in the orange and purple. Okay. And these long chains are going to be interacting with each other, sit there and form some type of typically complex structure that allows it to have a specific function and a specific target. We have the steroid hormones. And so these guys are typically derived from lipid cholesterol. And so again, you have very complex hydrocarbon chains, so you have your ring structures that exist. And then, so this is testosterone and progesterone. Okay, and we know that both of these are responsible, these are your sex hormones, right? Testosterone is male, progesterone is the precursor for estrogen. Okay, oops. And if you take a look at the structure, right, between the two, the difference between the two is very minimal, right? We have that OH group there. And instead of that OH group, we have a ketone. Remember that? Actually, both of you guys talked about that in both of your classes, right? Okay. So instead of a hydroxyl group, a ketone. And so that is the only distinction between testosterone and progesterone. Okay. Okay, actually, I'm going to go back one before we get too deep into this. Race. Okay, oops. Okay, so your pituitary gland has two. It has the anterior component, and it is responsible for production of certain hormones. One of the hormones that is responsible for is the growth hormone. Okay. Okay, so we have the growth hormone, And so we know that that's responsible for growth, right? So then we also have prolactin. That's responsible for milk production. We have thyroid stimulating hormone. Let me type this out because my handwriting is horrible. So what do you think that does? Azucena, what do you think the thyroid stimulating hormone does?
It controls your metabolism and the
Yeah.
way you use the energy.
It does, but it actually, what it does specifically, it controls the thyroid, which controls your metabolism, right?
Mhm.
So it stimulates the thyroid to start, or the thyroid to start releasing hormones. Okay. And there's about 15 more, that are there, but in the posterior, we have that oxytocin. Okay, and so this basically stimulates childbirth or contraction childbirth. So you could imagine that this is probably not produced in men, right?
Yeah.
No.
Okay. So all of these here, these are all examples of some of the hormones that are produced in the pituitary gland, right? So that's the posterior and the anterior parts of the gland. And so in the thyroid, we have, and I'll talk about some of them that we've talked about before. We have thyroxine, which is it controls the basal rate of your. Do you guys know what I mean by basal rate? Basal levels. You've heard that term before?
Well, no, I have not.
Basal is kind of like normal. So like so with everything, there's a threshold. You have to have a threshold, a level that things that are normally at. That's considered the basal level. And then sometimes we go above that threshold, so then that's elevated, right? And then something that you go below that level, then that's, that would be a hypo, or, so basal level is the level that you normally see things at. Above that, so you have a level of background or a level that's normal. And then you could have something that's above it, or you could be below that. Okay, so this would be basal level of metabolism, or basal rate. Okay, and then kind of talked about this before. Calcitonin, which basically reduces calcium, the calcium ion. In the blood. Oops. Okay, so those are two examples of of hormones that are found in the thyroid or that are produced by the thyroid. And then we have the adrenaline gland. So we have epinephrine. We have cortisol. And we have aldosterone. Okay, so aldosterone basically increases the sodium levels in blood, sodium ion levels. Cortisol. Come on. So that's going to increase our blood glucose levels. And the epinephrine is going to stimulate that flight or fight response. Oops. Okay, so pancreas, that's responsible for insulin. Okay, and we know that insulin reduces, reduces blood glucose levels. We also have our glucagon, which increases. And then in our ovaries, we have estrogen and progesterone. Okay, and so we know that those are important for female development. And in our testes, we have testosterone. Okay, so some of the examples of of the different hormones? Sorry, getting trouble with my slides there. Here. Okay, so we had talked about the different hormones, right? So we know that there are different types. We said there was the protein, there was the amine hormones, there was the peptide hormones, there was the protein hormones, there were the steroid hormones, right? So we know that the hormones that we're talking about have particular targets on the cells that they're going to. And so these are often called the hormone receptors. So if we take a look here, so these are lipid-soluble hormones, right? In this case of a lipid-soluble hormone, the lipid-soluble hormone is going through the bloodstream. It goes through to the extracellular matrix. It binds to the cell membrane, right? So once it goes to the cell membrane, it's internalized. And part of that internalization is done by a receptor hormone complex. So the hormone is actually binding to a receptor, and it helps for the transport into the system. So then that hormone receptor complex is going to be able to enter the nucleus, and then it's going to be able to sit there and cause genes to be turned on, okay, through gene transcription. So then those genes that are being turned on, they're going to be producing messenger RNA, and as a result of that, you're going to get various proteins that are going to be made. Okay, but because we know that lipid structures is going to be can interact directly with the membrane, right? And so that's the key component is that these lipid structures are able to sit there and interact with that membrane directly. It can diffuse in the membrane because it's lipids. Lipids like lipids. So they're cool with things like lipids going through, where things that are polar or hydrophilic, they're not going to want to sit there and let through. So they're going to need things that are going to be polar or charged aren't going to be able to go through that membrane where these guys are. So as a result, we need another system for other types of hormones, right? Because we have peptide hormones that could either be polar or non-polar, depending on what they are. You see. So these are like water-soluble hormones. So water-soluble hormones, these guys are going to sit there and they're going to go to the bloodstream, they're going to go to the extracellular matrix, and then when they get to the extracellular matrix, they're going to actually have to bind to a receptor on the cell surface. In this case, this receptor here is well, here's our cell receptor. Below it, we have a G protein that's attached to that. That sends a signaling cascade. So it sends a signal. This G protein processes GDP, and then that GDP then causes that ATP to be processed. Then we get cyclic AMP made. Cyclic AMP causes these protein kinases to be activated. So this activated protein kinase then activates and phosphorylates, or in this case, phosphorylates another component, right? And so, and in this case, that's what we're basically going to be taking ATP. A kinase basically will take ATP and make it ADP, and it uses that phosphate group to activate a protein. So then that protein becomes activated, right? And so when that protein becomes activated, that protein could end up affecting the expression of other things, because then it's able to either move itself across the membrane of the nucleus and interact with the DNA and causes act as a transcriptional factor, or it could just be that protein itself has a particular function that's associated with what the target was trying to do. Okay, so it could be a direct effect or it could be a downstream effect. Are you with me?
Yeah.
Okay. I know today is a rough day, isn't it? It's coming back after Mother's Day. Everybody's like, do I have to really be here? Because mom is so comforting. Okay, so adrenaline often will act on what we call a negative feedback loop. So this is going to be basically an example of the release of the adrenaline glucocortical, and that basically is going to stimulate the release of hormones of the hypothalamus and I'm in trouble with that today. Pituitary gland. Sorry, I don't know why I'm struggling with it today. So now the signal is going to be inhibited by glucocortical levels, and as a result of that stimulation, since those levels are going to become elevated, it's actually also going to cause the negative signals to the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. Let's see. So before I go into the nitty-gritties of this, so there's typically two types of feedback, right? So as I said, there's the negative feedback loop, and then there's also a positive feedback, right? So an example of the positive feedback loop is when we're talking about childbirth. So the release of a hormone basically causes that original hormone to sit there and cause that contraction during childbirth, right? And as a result of those contractions, you end up with childbirth and you're pushing out the baby. So the levels of that will end up increasing during that process right before childbirth, and then that causes childbirth to occur. And after childbirth, then those levels decrease. And so that there's going to be considered a positive feedback. Where a negative feedback is going to be kind of like, so we have an increase in the glucocortical hormones, and then that is then going to have a direct effect on, so we have basically CRH here, and that's going to basically start the production of the glucocortical hormone. That's going to be released, and so as the concentration of glucocortical increases in the bloodstream, because that's going to be released in the blood, the levels are going to go up, right? So then these levels are then going to affect the CHR hormone, and so it's going to cause the hormone to be inhibited. So then we're going to stop getting the production of the glucocortical levels as a direct result of that as well too. Okay, so in other words, the hormone that you're stimulating that is elevating, when it gets to high enough levels, it'll actually start inhibiting. And so that's what makes it that negative feedback, right? So we had it being stimulated by that same hormone. So the hypothalamus, is going to be releasing the cortical protein releasing hormone CHR. That's going to stimulate the glucocortical hormone, those levels are going to increase in the blood. And as those guys continue to increase, that same protein inhibits the CHR. So, and then as a result of that, we get the inhibition of the glucocortical hormone. Okay, so it's basically going to have a nice little balance that it kind of controls itself, right? So it kind of dictates its own fate. Too much of it, if we're producing too much, it causes the inhibition of the production of that first hormone that causes the other hormone to be produced. Okay, so in this case, this just basically shows you the homeostasis of the process. So if we have an imbalance, we have too much, right? Or we have too little in the first case. And then if we have too little, there's not enough to sit there and inhibit the CHR. So then the CHR is stimulated and then it's released. Then that causes the adrenal gland to sit there and produce the glucoprotein. And so then it goes through and then it starts producing enough to make that correction. Okay. And then if we have too much, it shuts it off, right? But if we have a balance, it can kind of continue. It'll keep it on. So if those levels are low enough, then you can continue that process. But if the balance is too high, then you can just jump off of it. Does that make sense? Yes, no, maybe? Okay. So what is the difference between a positive feedback loop and a negative feedback loop?
A positive when you were talking about with the childbirth, after childbirth, and
Positive feedback will be like when you increase the changes that are going on, and the negative feedback will be like when you're reducing those changes.
Okay. But can't we also increase the changes as well with a negative feedback loop?
Yeah.
Yeah. So a positive feedback loop, a way of looking at it is, so a negative feedback loop basically has the ability to make the correction. Where a positive feedback loop, so in the case of the childbirth, right? So let's say we go through, we produce too much of the oxytocin, right? So if we produce too much of that, then do we shut off the production of it, or does it just continues until there's no longer childbirth?
it would continue till there's no more childbirth.
Okay, so it'll just keep going until there's no longer childbirth. So regardless of whether you make too much of it or too little of it, it's still going to continue, right? It's going to continue to sit there and make it. It's not going to make that adjustment. Where in the case of the negative feedback loop, you have the ability to correct that balance because the levels of one of your hormones is also being used to control the levels of the thing that initially got it started. Does that make sense? So in addition to what it's doing, it also has a negative impact, the ability to inhibit the production of itself. Okay, does that make sense? The difference between the two. One is like you have a dual switch of controlling your negative feedback. Hey, our levels got too high, so we need to shut it down. So we use that same protein to sit there and shut it down. So it negatively impacts the same pathway that is being used to stimulate it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Where the other one, you only get the production. Hey, we're getting production. Hey, we're good, right? We're not using that to sit there and control the levels. And so we do it till the contraction runs out. It makes what it makes, and then it just dissipates. It doesn't control it. And so it depends on the type of control that you need, right? I need to get a better example, I have to think about a better example, a real life example that we can do daily on that, but I'll think about it and get back to you on it. Okay, so here's the hypothalamus, pituitary complex. So here's the anterior and here's the posterior of the pituitary. So this is the thalamus here. This is the hypothalamus. This is the infundibulum stalk, and in the orange. Okay, so as we mentioned earlier, there's various hormones that are going to be produced by the pituitary. Part of them are going to be in the anterior, and part of them are going to be posterior. We talked about a few of those. We talked about the growth hormones. We talked about prolactin for the posterior pituitary. We have the oxytocin, and then we have like a couple of them that are kind of produced in between the two of them, right? Between the posterior and the anterior components as well. And that's like the melanocyte stimulating hormone. Okay, let me see. Okay, so we also know that that the thalamus is also responsible for producing some of the hormones that are responsible for the neurotransmission as well. And so, and we kind of got that, we've talked about the hypothalamus and that area having effect on the nervous system. So for instance, we have in our body what we call osmotic receptors. And so one of the hormones that are responsible that binds to the osmotic receptors is antidiuretic hormones, ADH. And so those receptors that we pick up from our nervous system are going to be controlled or stimulated by the ADH hormone. And so it's able to sit there and monitor the osmotic pressure or the osmolarity that's associated with our blood as a direct result of that. So this is just basically a schematic that shows you that. So we have the secretory cells, and so these guys are able to sit there and result in the release of the ADH, and then we have the secretory superoptical nucleus. And so, and that guy is going to be responsible for in the case of contractions, because we know that is a muscular event. So the oxytocin And so the two components there are sitting there, they're showing you the post lobe of the pituitary gland. And so we basically can see that the hormone is going to be either released or is it going to be stored in the bloodstream. So it's going to be released or stored in this bloodstream. And as a result of that, that's going to cause the contractions to occur in the case of the OT. And then in the case of the ADH, it's going to determine our response to various meals. Our blood pressure is going to go up as a result of that. Are we going to, which is going to cause our blood pressure to go up. And so the ADH is, this guy's a negative feedback loop. And we know that this guy is a positive feedback loop. Okay. Let's see. So, not? So in the case, oops, sorry, it was going on its own. In the case of the anterior pituitary gland, it's going to be manufacturing some, at least 7 different hormones. Okay, so here we have, we're going to have our growth hormone. We're going to have our thyroid stimulating hormone, our adrenaline corticotropic hormone, our follicle stimulating hormone, our beta endorphin hormone, prolactin, missing one. The labetalol hormone. And so these guys, in this case, are going to, the hypothalamus is going to release the hormone. Then those hormones are going to stimulate the pituitary to sit there and release those seven components. So, or the components that are going to be responsible for either growth, are going to be responsible for stimulating the thyroid or the adrenal corticotropic hormone, which then is going to be stimulating the adrenaline gland. Okay, so then you have, I guess, yes, those hormones that are going to stimulate other glands' hormones as well. And so this guy, again, is going to be happening in the pituitary gland. So if we have effects in the pituitary gland, it can actually affect the glands of other downstream, the production of other downstream hormones by affecting the glands that they are responsible for stimulating. Does that make sense? So like, for instance, if we talk about the growth hormone, we know that the growth hormone is going to be generated in the anterior pituitary gland, right? So the hypothalamus is going to release hormones. That's going to causes those hormones to stimulate the pituitary gland. Pituitary gland is then going to make the growth hormone. Then that growth hormone is going to be affecting the hypothalamus, or so. Sorry, growth hormone is then going to be, the growth hormone is going to be released. It's going to be affecting the glucose sparing effect. So it's going to stimulate adipose cells. So to let them know that, hey, we need to start breaking down some of that fat, and then we're going to need to use it for fuel. It's also going to start causing growth effects. right? So it's going to increase the uptake of amino acid from blood. It's going to enhance cellular proliferation, and it's going to reduce apoptosis. So in other words, cells aren't going to be dying as bad, but we're going to be making more cells, okay? And then it's going to have that thiogenic effect. So then that growth hormone is going to then go and break down glycogen into glucose, and then that's going to add more fuel for growth. Okay, so if we have high levels of the insulin-like growth factor, the IGF-1, so that's going to cause the hypothalamus to basically try to shut down that growth inhibition. So then in that case, we're going to be producing a growth hormone inhibiting hormone. And so that's going to be responsible for inhibiting the growth hormone. And so then that's going to basically inhibit the growth hormone in the pituitary gland, the anterior pituitary gland. So then we're not going to get the release of growth hormone. And as a result of that, we're not going to have any of this happening, right? So you're not going to get these effects occurring. Okay, and then so what's responsible for this, right? So if we go through this process and we start making, we start stimulating further growth, that we're producing all these cells, there's going to be a point where our liver is going to start releasing the insulin-like growth factor. And that guy, even though you have growth being stimulated initially, it's also going to serve as an inhibitor for this process. So high levels of that is going to inhibit this process. So is this guy a positive feedback loop, or is this a negative feedback loop?
For the, it would be, would it be a negative?
That's right. It would be a negative feedback loop. Right? Because it's the same thing that is getting us started, right? So we get we have our growth occurring, right? We get to the point where we've gotten so much growth, it comes back and it inhibits that same item that kind of got us started, you know, that growth hormone. Okay. Okay, so these are the major pituitary hormones and their targets. And so, although you can't see it in the table, it's in your book, and even in your book, it's pretty small. But we have the ADH. So the ADH pituitary. So with the release of the ADH, you're going to get storage. It's going to store ADH, that hormone. And then the targets are going to be your kidney, it's going to be your sweat glands, and it's going to be the circulatory system. And then the effect is that's going to be affecting our water balance. We know what OT stands for, that oxytocin. So that's going to be female reproductive system, and that's going to contribute, it's going to trigger contractions. Excuse me. Let's see. Let's see. So here we have the TRH. So then that's going to be the THS, that's the thyroid stimulating hormone. And then as a result of that, that's going to be the target is going to be the thyroid gland. And then we're going to get stimulation and release of the thyroid hormones. We have the PRH, which is going to be a hormone that is responsible for the prolactin hormone being produced. And then as a result, that the target is going to be the mammary glands for the production of milk. So we have the growth hormone releasing hormone, and then that's going to be responsible for the production of the growth hormone. Then that's going to cause, the targets are going to be the blood, the muscle, the bone, the muscle, and the liver. And then the results of that is going to induce the production of insulin-like growth factor. And of course, you're going to get growth. You're going to get high growth occurring from that and a high metabolism, but you're also going to be producing your insulin-like growth factors. And so there are other ones there as well, but those are the main ones that we've talked about. Regardless, kind of keep it to that. Be prepared for the exam for others. Okay, so this here is the thyroid gland. So we know that the thyroid gland is basically, it's located in the neck, and it's wrapped around the trachea. And so we're not going to go too much into the anatomy of aspects of things, but just the idea that it is located here and it is wrapped around the trachea. So its function, right? The thyroid gland is typically a negative feedback loop, okay? And so in this case, we have the metabolic rate is going to be kind of dictated by that thyroid gland, and so there are a few thyroid hormones. So we have T3 and T4, and so these guys, based upon their concentration, we determine whether or not we have a low, or whether it's low or high. So if it's low, then the hypothalamus is going to release your thyroid release hormone, and then this is going to be triggering the thyroid stimulation to be released by the pituitary gland. And then as a result of that, this guy is going to result in the thyroid stimulating hormone being produced, and then that's going to stimulate our thyroid hormones. Okay, so then after that stimulates our thyroid hormones, the TH3 levels are going to go up, and so then we can go back to that process. So if the levels here are then released, then that's going to cause an increase in the basal metabolism rate of the body, and then it's going to affect our body temperature. Our body temperature is going to rise as a result of that. Okay, now if the levels are too high, then typically what happens is the hypothalamus stops the THR being released, and then that's going to cause the anterior pituitary gland to stop the THS, and so then you're not going to stimulate the production of thyroid, so it's going to stop that. And so, but all of that is, again, it's going to be based upon the levels. So if the levels are too high, it comes to this way. So again, a negative feedback loop. Okay, so this is an example of a defect that results from the endocrine system. So this is a goiter, and if you have iodine defect, so you guys know that like a lot of the salts that we use is ionized, the addition of iodine in it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
So our body needs a small amount of iodine for development. If we don't have enough iodine in our system, or if we have much, we cause the thyroid to either be hypostimulated. You're not getting enough of the thyroid hormones being produced, and if that is happening, that's going to affect your growth, and so you won't get growth, you won't get full development, so the child will end up being deaf, and so you get issues with just that growth component, right? If there's not enough stimulation of your thyroid. If there's too much stimulation of your thyroid, and iodine is responsible for that, then you're going to end up with too much growth. And so in that case, then you're going to get those borders that are going to be starting to form, right? And so you'll get people's eyes that start to bulge more. They're often going to be inflamed and around the orbitals, so you're going to have a lot of redness and effect and infection in that area. So if you have too much stimulation with the thyroid, okay, so it's essential that our body does a good job of affecting that metabolic rate, right? Because too much, right, could result in the formation of the goiter, and then also rise your heart rate, excessive body heat. Often you'll have issues with weight loss and tremors. And then too little affects growth, right? So you're not going to be as tall. You're going to have deficiencies in development. So you could end up being mute and deaf or deaf. And it also issues with bone development as well too. So, okay. Okay, so here, this is an image of the parathyroid gland, which is going to be a tiny, you see it right here, you see them right there. So they're basically little tiny round structures that are going to be embedded in the thyroid gland itself, so, or near the surface of the thyroid gland. And then this is just a histological slide of the parathyroid tissue. So these cells, I mean, the primary function of the parathyroid gland cells, they're kind of like the chief cells. They're in charge of regulating the levels of calcium, calcium levels. And so they are going to basically produce the parathyroid and I'm over, right?
Just a little.
The parathyroid hormone. And so, and this guy is going to be secreted when we have low levels of calcium in our blood, the calcium ion in our blood. And so this is going to cause calcium to basically be released from our bones. And so that means that it's going to be inhibiting osteoblasts. And so, and these cells are responsible, these are the cells that are responsible for bone deposit. And then it also causes the reabsorption of calcium into our kidneys and to be filtering. So you guys have heard of kidney stones?
Yes.
Okay. So often kidney stones are a result of this system not functioning effectively, right? So we get so much production of, or so much release of calcium from the bones that you're starting to get accumulation of the calcium in the kidney itself to form the stone. So like often when we age, as a result of aging, we start the formation of kidney stones. Some youth have this issue at a very early age. They start to get the precipitation of calcium in their kidneys because they're producing so much. Also as a result of that, they also have issues with their bones, easy bone breakage. Okay. So this process is often controlled by vitamin D, or vitamin D3 to be specific. And so, let's see. I think I'm going to stop here and we'll talk about that process and the whole blood calcium homeostasis when we get back on Wednesday. Well, I'll talk about it in the evening lecture that you guys can see on Wednesday. Is that cool?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So on Wednesday, though, I'm going to be going over 3 lectures. I'm going to be going over chapters 17, 18, and 19. So I'm going to have those recorded for you. I'm going to try to get them recorded tomorrow night, hopefully, for Jesse to put up, hopefully. Depends on how my Tuesday go. So I have a couple of meetings I have to go through on Tuesday. So today, you guys don't have a lab. You have a simulation. Is that correct, Jesse? Do we already have those up?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. On Wednesday, you're also not going to have a lab. So the last lab that we're going to do with the fish is going to be next week. It'll be on next Wednesday. And then not this week, but next week will be my last set of lectures that I'll be putting up. Then we're done. Is that right, Jesse? Or am I wrong? Yeah, so.
I believe so.
Okay. You guys I will have a written test for you guys to do for your 4th test. I'll be working on that tomorrow. So it'll be available on Thursday. That's going to be due at the end of the semester. And then you're also going to have your final. Okay. And so your final is pretty much going to cover the last few chapters that we covered. And it's going to have maybe a few questions, 2 or 3 questions, all multiple guess. Everything's going to be multiple guess. Few questions from like 2 or 3 questions from each chapter, but it's going to be primarily the very last 3 chapters that we're going to cover. Okay.
So for our final exam, it's all gonna be multiple choice.
All
Really?
multiple choice, yes. And you also get to use all the cheat sheets that you have.
Okay.
Okay. So thing. So I will be sending a message out with that later. So it should be really hard to fail the test. That's all I'm saying. Okay.
Yeah.
Tyrell, if you don't mind staying afterwards.
Yeah, I was.
Okay. Good. Okay. Okay. I will see you guys. I won't see you on Wednesday unless you come to the evening lecture. You know. I'll see you guys the following week then.
Okay.
Okay. Have a good day.